relationships and all the good things that God had created in the universe. But God not giving up, God continuing to work in and through human history and with humans, and teaching and revealing more of himself along the way as humans turn to him and as they would trust him and follow him. So that's been a big, it's not written, but that's been really the main overarching theme that we've seen. Will we, human beings, will we trust this God? And then when we live out that trust. Because when we do, as he's told us and shown us time and time again, that's where life and blessing are. When we turn from him for whatever reason, take things into our own hands, whether it's just full-on wickedness and debauchery, or us just trying to do the best we can our own, it does not go well. And God has forewarned and shown us that doesn't end well. But even then, even when we make a mess of things, again, human beings, God is good and he is gracious and he's kind. If we'll turn back to him, repent, trust him, and follow him, he redeems, he renews, he restores. He keeps the story going because he is not going to let anything stop him from his good purposes. And so we've seen how that's played out in a lot of different ways. And God choosing Abraham and his family, making these great promises and this covenant relationship with them. And we've tracked all throughout the Old Testament and history. Again, we've covered huge chunks of time from a bird's eye view. But we've seen how God continues to be faithful. God continues to teach and show his people who he is and what it means to belong to him and trust him and follow him. And we've seen them kind of all over the map, but he keeps them moving forward. So through slavery and pulling them out at the Exodus, and then as they're wandering in the wilderness on the way to the promised land, he's shaping them, teaching them, showing them, again, what it means to be his people. So the sacrificial system, the law, the tabernacle, their great inheritance, all these things. Settling into the promised land, the ups and downs that went with that, the cycle that they fell into, moving into the monarchy, the divided kingdom, being sent into exile, and then coming back from exile and things not quite being what they had thought. And again, along the way, God has been saying the same things, and he hasn't changed. They've changed in various ways, and history has changed. Things on the surface have changed, but God's promises have continued, and he's built upon them. So his promises to Abraham, and then he makes promises to and through Moses, and then through David, and he's building up. We can see this is going somewhere. This isn't accidental. God has a plan, truly a plan. And the people, age by age, era by era, stage of history by stage of history, are learning what does it look like for us at this point in history, looking back in history of our people who've come before us, their victories and successes and their failures. How can we learn from that? And then how can we be faithful right here? And then looking forward, what does it look like for us moving forward in faithfulness and trust of God? In each era, it looks a little different, but it's still on that bedrock of will we trust God and follow him despite the circumstances around us? And God has always been faithful. So the people come back by the end of the Old Testament. They're back in the land. They're back. They have all the defining characteristics of what it meant, they thought, to be God's people. They were in their own land. They rebuilt the temple. They had the sacrifices. They had worship up and going. They had some degree of prosperity again. Things were good again. But it seemed limited. There's like a ceiling to it. It seemed limited. And they still had a foreign power over them. They weren't really self-governing at that point. So they were really wrestling with, okay, well, what is God doing then? We've seen that he's been faithful. We've seen that if we will open our eyes and trust and have faith, he will guide us and show us what he's up to, so we might join him and move in those directions. But something's quite off. And then we got to the end of our Old Testament, the Old Covenant, if you will, and then Scripture for us goes silent. History didn't go silent. They still had a lot of ups and downs and things moving forward, but for 400 years. And then last week we got to, let's see if I can forward my slide, this point. And as we had closed the Old Testament, God had sent, again, prophets all along the way to speak and to teach and to lead and to call the people back and to call the people out and point the people forward and point the people up to him and so on and so forth. But as the Old Testament was closing, Malachi in particular was mentioning God is going to show up again. Be ready. And how are you going to know he's coming? Well, he's going to send a messenger ahead of him. And Isaiah had said similar things. And so the people had been looking and watching and waiting, essentially, in various ways, for God to show up and make things good again, to make things right, to come through fully on his promises. And we know, just like if we were to scan this room, we all believe the same things, pretty much. But there's going to be some variation of how we understand that and how we live that out in just this size. So if we can imagine an entire people, an entire nation, there's going to be some differences in how they understood what God was going to do to make things right, and when he was going to do it, and what it meant for Malachi to say, and Isaiah to say, I'm sending my messenger ahead of me. So they were looking for God's messenger to come, because after the messenger, the Messiah, the chosen one, was going to show up. And they had that general idea, but they had different understandings of what that would mean and what it would look like. And we covered this, I think, last week. And so we had groups like the Pharisees, and they had certain particular notions on what it meant to be faithful and for God to come back. And then the Sadducees and the Zealots, and so on and so forth. So they were all generally open, hoping, wanting God to show up and to make things right, but no one really knew what that was going to mean or look like. And then John the Baptist comes bursting onto the scene, and he said, it's here. The time is now. This longing in your heart, and this is my Aaron paraphrase of the opening of the New Testament, this longing in your heart, this desire, the stories that you've known, the heritage that you've leaned on, it's coming to fulfillment here and now. And like, oh, is it you? He says, no, it's not me. It's who comes after me. And who comes after him? Jesus. Both literally and figuratively. Jesus then, shows up on the scene, and John keeps pointing everyone, it's him, it's him, it's him, it's him. And Jesus says, it's me. And he starts his ministry, and he gathers his 12 disciples, and he's preaching, and he's teaching, and he's doing all these things, and people don't quite know what to do with him. But what we covered last week, the big idea that we were really trying to hammer home last week, is that Jesus did not come up out of nowhere, and isn't this fortunate that this Jesus figure is God in the flesh? Well, let's see what happens. We've been doing this study, and the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, do the same thing. He's not new. I mean, in a sense, he's new, but in a sense, he's not. This is the fulfillment. This is the continuation of this great story that God is writing, that we get to be brought into. And Jesus shows up and says, yes, it's here, this great kingdom that you're expecting, the great Messiah, God making things right. Now is the time. Repent. Believe in the good news, right? Turn to God, trust him, and follow him. So where we left last week was, again, Jesus is preaching, he's teaching, he's doing miracles, and that had happened before. They had various messiahs show up in varying degrees of success. All of them ultimately were not successful because they were still under foreign power. The kingdom had not been reestablished, and all those guys had eventually died, right? So Jesus shows up, and so they're intrigued, they're interested. The people are drawn to him because he was doing incredible things, feeding people, healing people, blessing those who are around him, and that is new. That is exciting. People are drawn to that. And then when they'd get there, he would teach, and he would teach in ways that they would say, the gospel writers tell us, the people were like, this guy's different. I mean, the way he's teaching and what he's teaching and the authority that he carries, we don't quite know what to do with him. And so we're seeing people drawn to him, people confused by him, people already, the religious leaders of the day and age, and all their various factions, were potentially intrigued by him, and then skeptical of him, and then in varying degrees opposed to him. And we're going to see that play out more tonight. But the disciples themselves, those closest to him, who he had called to follow him and who chose to follow him, they didn't even necessarily know what to do with him. And that's what we're going to look at tonight and see how Jesus works through that and what the gospel writers teach us and show us about Jesus and what kind of king he understood he was there to be. So let's start in Matthew 16. And as we're turning there, we'll be in Matthew 16, starting in verse 13, and then we'll be moving into chapter 17 in a little bit. Something that I mentioned last week again is we're trying to just hit really big ideas, and we'll kind of zoom in on a particular story, but then zoom back out. We said each of the gospel writers are covering the same story, but from their own unique perspective, and to their own specific audience that they're relaying the story to. So some of the language they'll use, some of the stories or the imagery, the things they emphasize might be a little different. That's why we see some differences across the four gospels. But we can recognize they're all telling the same story. So that should be really encouraging and uplifting to us. But if one of y'all could read, I'll write it down, Matthew 16, 13 through 23. Okay. Ooh. So there's a lot going on. My heart goes out to Peter. Peter, we're going to talk about Peter here in a minute, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. What do you think, as best as we can understand today, from our reading of Scripture and the Gospels, what do you think the 12 disciples, the original 12, what do you think they had in mind for Jesus? They had probably had a notion, understandably so, that he was going to be a conqueror of some degree. And again, we know from the different men of the 12, they had differences, different backgrounds, different areas of interest in their own lives, and they weren't all the exact same kind of guy or from the same background. But within that, I think it is safe to say they all had some understanding that this Jesus guy, he's going to save the day, and he's going to do it by all that we've ever known, which is power. Someone is powerful over us. We will have a leader who puts everyone else in their place and elevates God's people, because we've seen it all throughout history. That's what God has shown us. And so that's all they knew to understand. That's all they had seen, how things work. So why then did they have such a hard time when Jesus starts talking about his suffering? Yeah, again, a lot of grace for them. How could they have? They didn't. We didn't have. I mean, God had been telling them. Jesus was telling them, and they didn't have the bandwidth, as we say today, to wrap their minds. They didn't have categories for this to understand. As Jesus is telling them things, they're just like, yes, we agree, but they don't really understand what it is that they agree to. But we have this beautiful scene here where Jesus, at this point in his ministry, again, is very, very popular. Remember, they didn't have TV and the internet and newspapers like we do today. So word of mouth was how things spread. So people knew of this Jesus guy, the Nazarene, but they didn't necessarily know who he was or what he looked like or any of these things. But when they found out he was in town, he'd, get a quick crowd gathered around him. And so there were a lot of rumors, understandably, going around about who Jesus was. I mean, all across society, as Jesus' star rose, if you want to put it that way. All the way up to Herod, I was reading today, was really curious about this Jesus guy. He's popular. Is he like some of the other popular people we've seen, or do we need to worry about him? Like, he's an intriguing figure. And so Jesus, aware of these things, asks his disciples, so who do people think I am? And they're pulling out all sorts of answers as people are doing the best they can, trying to figure out, well, maybe he's John the Baptist, come back, because John the Baptist had been beheaded. Maybe he's, some of our Old Testament prophets or whatever, and Jesus asks, well, who do you think I am? And Peter really nails it. And Jesus, in such an encouraging way, says, absolutely. Again, this is my paraphrase. That is more true than you could possibly understand. But you didn't come to this yourself. You are listening and receptive and open to my Father in heaven. He's showing you the truth, right? And so when we stop there at verse 20, Jesus goes into and explains, Peter, that you're right. This testimony, this confession you've made is more right than you possibly know. The implications of this confession are way bigger than you could possibly know. And then he says these beautiful things about building his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And just an overwhelmingly beautiful, uplifting moment. And then he turns right around and he's telling them the way forward, the way we're going to get to this beautiful future that God has in store, this great victory that we're all hoping and longing for, is I'm going to suffer and then I'm going to die. And Peter, with the best of intentions, says, well, no, of course not, right? And we would do the same thing, wouldn't we? Because in our minds, that's not how that, if you die, then it's all over. No revolution, no victory, no kingdom. All our hopes are in you, Jesus, and we don't really even fully understand our hopes, but whatever we do, we're put it all on you. So why would you, we'll never let you. And Peter, I think with the best of intentions, and the other disciples were probably nodding along, was thinking that this is the right thing to say and do. Maybe Jesus is testing me, and I'm going to show him. I'll never let him suffer. I'll never let him die. We'll protect him at all costs. And Jesus gives him this, scathing rebuke. How do you think Peter and the other disciples, whoever was gathered around in that moment, how do you think they responded? How do you think they felt? Yeah, the rest of the guys are like, oh, okay. I'm glad Peter said something and not me. But how do you think Peter responded? Because Jesus doesn't just say, and I do want to spend some time exploring this, Jesus doesn't just say, hey, Peter, you're missing the point. He says, get out of my way, Satan. You're an obstruction. You've now become an opponent, an adversary to God's will and God's kingdom. Get out of my way. That's incredibly strong language, right on the heels of this beautiful moment. And now he's saying you couldn't be even further from the kingdom if you tried. So Peter, probably understandably, was stunned, disoriented, confused, hurt, upset, all these things. But it shows us at least two things here. What Jesus is doing is bigger than any of them could have possibly understood in that moment. And this isn't just about, hey, I support this person versus that person. Jesus is operating at levels that Peter and the others couldn't begin to fathom. But what they needed to do wasn't try to fathom it, try to figure out what exactly Jesus was up to. What did they need to do? What have God's people from the beginning needed to do? Trust him and then follow him. And there's no problem asking, can you help? Or can you clarify? We trust you. We want to. We see Jesus throughout the Gospels, especially God in the flesh. If you want to know what God is and looks like, look to Jesus, right? And we see the people that Jesus is so patient with and so gentle with and so merciful with are the people who don't have it together but know it and come to him and just say, I don't know, but I'm coming to you. And he has all the time in the world for someone like that, all the peace and the grace and the mercy for someone like that. The people he's very hard on are those who think they have it all figured out and try to tell him what to do or what to be or anything like that. We see a lot of issues there. But the picture of what we're seeing, what Peter found out in a hard way, which then became a really good lesson for everyone, then even us today. Look again at verse 23. Jesus gets down to the core of it. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not what? Setting your things on the mind of God, or setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. So what is the core issue here? It's not Peter's passion or his desire to help, to protect, to love, to serve Jesus. That's not a problem at all. What's the issue? He's focused on the wrong thing. Yeah, yeah. Right. And so, like God has done throughout the story, through the judges and through the prophets and God's leaders throughout history, calling the people to wake up and to respond. And you don't have to have it all figured out, but you do need to be humble enough to turn to God, to trust Him, and then follow as He leads you forward. And so that's what Peter is seeing, but then we're also getting just a taste here. What's the old saying? So-and-so is playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers. So Peter and the other disciples, and really everyone else, was working with just a really flat view of life and history, of God's kingdom, of victory. All these things were really limited to what they knew and understood, which was very limited. And Jesus, in a really stunning fashion here, is blowing the top off of that and said, there's more going on here than you could possibly imagine. It's bigger and it's better. So you can get on with this and move forward with this, but if you continue with even the best intentions to bring about God's kingdom your way, you're just going to be in the way. And that's what Peter and the others had to understand. Because what God was doing here was, again, not giving up on what He had started, and in some beautiful, wonderful, mysterious, in the depths of His infinite wisdom and mercy and grace, God chose to enter into the darkness and the brokenness of our world and turn it inside out. So Jesus said, God's plan, this isn't an accident. I'm telling you up front before it happens. So when it gets there and you see me suffering and dying, you can trust that God is still up to something and that this is the way forward. It's not going to make sense, but will you trust? And they couldn't get it. Jesus is saying, God is redeeming all things that sin and death has corrupted. I'm going to enter into death itself and turn it inside out. Go ahead. Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. 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 I don't fault them at all. I would have been in the same boat with them.
So they're wanting some relief. They just don't see that it's
Yeah.
deeper, like chess versus checkers.
Yeah. Yeah. And they too, and the disciples are, again, the older I've gotten and the more life has humbled me, I have so much more grace for them than I did when I was younger. Like, how do these guys not get it? They're walking with Jesus. He's teaching, He's preaching, He's doing all these miracles. Well, I have plenty of examples from my own life of how I don't get it, and I have the full revelation, in front of me. So a lot of grace for them. But we do see, again, with God's people in that day and age, that era, so much of the same stuff of each generation that had gone before them. God doing God things. Will they remember and trust and follow? Or when that memory fades, will they turn again to their own devices and their own understanding of what the rest of the world around them is telling them victory looks like and power looks like? Or will they remember, I'm the God that pulled you out of slavery in Egypt in ways no one else possibly could. Will you trust me and follow me? And they did for a bit, and then they forgot, and so on and so forth. So we're seeing a lot of repeated themes. But what I want to move forward from here is what Matthew puts right after this passage. Jesus is suffering, and the way of victory, somehow being through suffering, isn't just about Jesus, more widely to those who follow Him. So if someone could read Matthew 16, 24 through 28. Okay. Again, it's really easy for us, in the comfort of this room, with the freedoms that we have, this wonderful book in front of us, a passage we've read so many times, and be like, right on, that's awesome. The disciples, and I don't know the exact timeline. Matthew here doesn't timestamp it for us, but the way that he presents it here in his gospel, we have really important, distinct moments following each other. So Peter's great confession and how Jesus responds to that. Peter refusing to let Jesus suffer and how Jesus responds to that, and then what Jesus then says about their suffering and what it means to follow him into the victory that he's heading towards, taking up their cross to follow him, losing their life for him. That's really hard to hear and does not make a lot of sense to them. Because how can we bring about God's kingdom if we're all dead? How can we lead? How can we love? How can we serve? How can we do any of these things if you're dead as our leader or if we're dead as your followers? And it's not just that the cross, we're so familiar with it, I think we lose a lot of the meaning and the imagery behind crucifixion without overplaying it. It was intentionally awful, right? It was not just a way that the Romans would kill people. They had designed it in such a way to be a testament to their power. It was brutal, and it was dramatic, and it was public, and it was humiliating on purpose. And Jesus is aware of that. He uses that imagery on purpose. So his disciples they don't know what to do with this. They love him, they trust him, but they don't know what that means in this moment, and understandably so. But Jesus keeps promising, but this is the way forward. This is how God is going to bring about his great kingdom. This is how God is going to answer all the prayers of his people, to fulfill all the promises that he's made. But it's understandable at this point, especially. Jesus has said weird things before, or cryptic things. He's taught in parables. He's said, really extreme statements to make a point before. So we're okay. We're confused. We're a little upset, not fully understanding what he's talking about, but maybe he's going to explain as we move on. And then something else happens. Let's look at the next passage. Someone will keep reading. Matthew 17, 1 through 8. Okay. So, again, we don't know the exact time sequence of this, but Matthew puts these in order for us, the reader, to see these in order. So Peter understands Jesus isn't just different or better than other people. He's truly the Son of God. He is the Messiah. He is the chosen one. He is the guy. And Jesus says, you're exactly right. You're more right than you possibly know. By the way, part of me being the guy means I'm going to suffer and die and then rise again. God's kingdom will come. And Peter says, no way. And Jesus says, then no way for you. And by the way, you're all going to suffer if you want to follow me. You got to give up your life to find this new life. And they're kind of still reeling from that. And then from that moment, we move into this scene where Jesus is transfigured before them. How do you think in this moment, the three disciples that were with him, it tells us some of what they're thinking and feeling, but what do you think? How do you think they responded to that in that moment? Understandably afraid, yeah. Again, no real category for what we're seeing here, Lord. And then when God the Father speaks It's overwhelming, and they're just on the ground, terrified. Yeah. What else? What else do you think they were thinking or feeling? Or what do you think? Because they picked up on this is a significant moment, right? They recognized, and was it Peter? Where is it? Which verse? Yeah. He's like, hey, okay, so we recognize this is special. We don't get what it is. Do you want us to like set up tents and then we can figure it out together, or y'all can keep talking, or we don't know what to do, essentially. We're doing the best we can, Lord. And Jesus has a response for that. But what do you think is so significant about this scene? Why does this scene matter? What does this scene teach us, show us, reveal to us? Yeah. So Moses shows up. We've heard of Moses. He's very key on our timeline. He becomes not a legendary, an iconic figure, a representative figure of a major part of the Old Testament, the law, right? The Mosaic law. I mean, he was the great leader of the Old Testament. And then we have Elijah, and what does he represent? The prophets. Yeah, so the law and the prophets here represented with their like most prominent leaders from history somehow are showing up on this hill, and they're conversing with Jesus, and Jesus is glowing like a bright big neon sign. And if that's not overwhelming enough, the voice of God shows up, and what does he say? This is my son. What else does he say? I love him. He's my beloved. I'm well pleased. But then there's a new phrase here, because we heard all that at the baptism, right? Listen to him. Peter, his little brain, my little brain is just like a hamster on a wheel, just spinning and trying to fathom what is going on. You don't have to fully understand what you're seeing, how this works, but will you trust the voice of God, and will you follow Jesus? That's what's before them. Again, all the promises, all the buildup, all the story is coming to fruition, to fulfillment in Jesus. And Jesus is saying and showing the way it's coming to fruition isn't what you expected, but it's better. Again, will you trust me, and will you follow me and not get distracted or turned away from it? And so this was key in that moment to verify all the things Jesus had been saying and doing. I mean, not just in the immediate passages that we read, but in his life and ministry up to that moment. But this was going to be a profound moment moving forward. Jesus here tells them to, hey, be quiet about this, because people aren't ready to understand what you've seen, but know that this isn't an accident. This is confirmation from God that something's happening, right? But then moving forward, especially when things start to get hairy and we're running out of time tonight, we'll talk more about it next week, but as Jesus moves into the final week of his life and then is suffering and then is put to death, they're going to start remembering, hopefully, a lot of the things that he'd been saying. So when they get to that moment, they're not unprepared. They still felt that way, understandably so. But even when it gets crazy, will you trust me and know that God is up to something? Will you trust me and know that God is up to something? And so Peter and James and John and the other disciples do have this choice. What Jesus are we wanting? Who are we wanting him to be? And we got to figure out real quick that if the Jesus we want him to be isn't the Jesus that he is, then we need to either change or stop following him, right? Because we can't force ourselves onto him, because he's the Son of God, and he is the master, not us. But if we keep dragging along, hoping he's somehow going to start doing things our way, it's not going to last. We're not going to make it. It's going to get too hard. We're going to burn out, or he will very clearly, like he did to Peter, say, you're opposing me, get out of my way, right? And so they're having these really clear moments where they have to come to terms with what they don't understand, but what they're seeing right in front of them. And will we trust it, and will we follow? And we'll talk more about that next week, because here, especially in Luke's gospel, pretty soon after this moment, the transfiguration, it says Jesus, it uses this really cool phrase, set his face towards Jerusalem. So his life and ministry up to that point mattered. Everything he did mattered. But when he gets to this point, it's now like he's laser locked on what's coming next. And I know we all know what's coming next, but I got a picture for it. The cross is looming, and Jesus is heading there. We're going to stop there, though, so we have time for prayer tonight. Any thoughts or questions on this? Go ahead.
I just, when Moses was getting the Ten Commandments and everything, I believe it was then that Moses realized to see God, the face of God, you have to die.
Yeah.
And so therefore, the moment of transfiguration was actually John the Baptist, the kingdom of heaven is at hand.
Yeah. Yeah. A truly overwhelming moment. And not things I have to really continually check myself in my heart for how kind of flippantly I can read through these stories as if they're stories. I'm so familiar with them or whatever. But to slow down and to think about what's going on here. This is remarkable. And again, a lot of grace and understanding for the disciples, not knowing quite what to do with it, but trying to do the best that they could in that moment. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So Moses and Elijah. Moses I get.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, brilliant. Elijah representing prophets. I mean, there's no book of Elijah. He did a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
You don't have a lot of
That's a good question. Yeah.
Isaiah maybe I would have got.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Elisha even seemed to do more.
Mm-hmm.
Why Elijah? Any clue?
I don't, off the top of my head, no. Jim, or did anyone else know? Yeah. Yeah. I think God didn't ask me, but if I were writing God's story, I would have chosen David or Solomon. God made such a clear covenantal promise, one of your line, kind of a key moment in salvation history. But God did not ask me who he should send to that moment. But yeah, I think Elijah became such a good representative figure of, the prophets and their writings and what God was saying through them through those years. It's a good question. I've never asked that question. I like that. I'm going to look that up. Okay, any other thoughts or questions tonight? This is good. I know I keep trying to say that, we're staying bird's eye view and trying to cover big themes as we move, but it's really hard not to get really down into the details of some of this. But what we're going to be doing, for the weeks moving forward, is seeing how Jesus does bring all this to life. He doesn't just cap it of like, hey, all right, we've gone through all this and now we're done. He redeems the whole storyline. He makes all of it come alive in new and profound ways, in beautiful ways. And then what we'll eventually get to, obviously, on the other side of the resurrection, the disciples now have a new question. Just as soon as they were figuring out who Jesus is and what it means to follow him, he dies, he rises again, and they're still trying to get a grip of that. And then he says, okay, now moving forward, go live and be different and tell the story. And we're still trying to figure out what you did, much less what's coming, but we'll talk about all those things. Okay, let's look at our prayer lists.